So yeah, I'll try to do two things in the next 20 minutes. Can you mute the TV? Thank you. So I want to speak about one concept, that's function creep, and one case, and that is kind of the COVID-19 governance and specifically contact tracing and leaks in the Netherlands. So yeah, I'll speak about how the contact tracing in the Netherlands was carried out and how some of the systems there malfunctioned. And I'll kind of bracket the case with a discussion of function creep, so that hopefully there is an example that can help you think about what function creep is. And my idea really is to use function creep kind of as an object to think with. So to think about the object, but also the case at the same time. So usually function creep is kind of understood as a specific kind of malfunction in an algorithmic system. So what people usually mean when they say function creep is that the functionality of an algorithmic system unintentionally expanded, so got wider, in a way that caused privacy infringements. And a kind of classic, maybe a bit old school example would be that you have a keycard system to access a building, for example, offices. And then the purpose of that keycard is to regulate access, to open the door. But if you then also have a log file of access and you access those logs, then you could kind of track maybe workers' attendance, and that would infringe on certain rights possibly. So it's often about these kind of privacy infringements due to, let's say, insufficiently defined functionalities. And yeah, I guess what's also important is that those are usually exceptions, and that this is also implemented in the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation of the European Union, as purpose limitation. So I made this kind of maybe cheeky graphic where like intent and use are supposed to be fixed, right? But what I want to do today is to kind of reframe function creep not as a malfunction, because as we also heard today, the functionality of an algorithmic system is mutable and it changes. So in a way, there's always creep at the core. Because algorithmic systems are multi-purpose technology. So they are so beneficial because they can be used for different purposes all the time, and their functionality is constantly changing. Yeah, and what I want to try and do is to kind of reframe it not as a malfunction, but as a disposition of computational infrastructure. So as kind of inclination to certain behavior, maybe. And then my question and idea is to use this inclination kind of as a trace of the political and economic interests that shape and move such an infrastructure. Because it seems to me that what matters is not that functions creep, so that functionality changes, but where that occurs and who is affected by these changes. And so my ambition or the challenge maybe today is to ask how we can use creep to study algorithmic systems in a different way, and to think about them as socio-technical systems, or as systems that are embedded in computational infrastructures that are shaped not just by technicalities, but by socio-cultural factors and economic interests. So basically this comes down to the question, how do algorithmic systems creep? And I'll come back to this, but maybe you can keep it in mind while I discuss briefly the case. So the case is the contact tracing infrastructure in the Netherlands. And it's a pretty straightforward case, but I think it's worth going into because it allows us to see how the computational infrastructure at the kind of core of the pandemic response was built. And what I mean by response is not kind of the predictive modeling, but it's also kind of a bit more simple, so that the provision of healthcare, provision of contact tracing, So, I mean, contact tracing, as you probably know, is the tracking of contacts of an infected person so that they can be tested or they can quarantine. And a lot of governments, sort of in the spring of last year, of 2020, started to think about or started to develop contact tracing apps also. But contact tracing is not really new. So we saw contact tracing, also digital contact tracing efforts before, for example, in the Ebola outbreak. And yeah, so the discussion around these apps was mostly around privacy. So common questions were like, should an app work with a decentralized or a centralized database? And should it use geolocation or Bluetooth? So kind of a local approach that you see on the slide here. And essentially, these are concerns about function creep. So will the app be used for its purpose, so for contact trace, or can it be used for surveillance? And in the Netherlands, like in many other countries, the government decided to go for a contact tracing app, their own, called CoronaCheck, but basing it basically on a framework by Google and Apple that you see at work here. So essentially, it exchanges between devices, also between Google and Apple devices, a unique session ID, instead of kind of having every person is assigning everyone one ID and storing it on a central database, where then you can kind of you could see contagion happen maybe. Yeah, so the idea here is to have a kind of a system that makes it difficult to link personally identifiable information across these sessions. And there are some reports, for example, to the government that explicitly say that the likelihood of function creep occurring here is low because this framework is safe and it's provided by Google and Apple. And as Google and Apple say, it can only be used during COVID-19. So, and the general, I think, opinion about this framework is that it kind of works. So it's a federated approach to privacy, differential privacy approach, as I understand it. But then if you look further into how contact tracing is really working, it's mostly carried out by humans because not everyone uses that app, and there's a way larger infrastructure at work where people simply call people up and ask them to list their contacts with phone numbers, and then they call those people up. And I looked a bit into the statistics, and so in week 34 of this year, less than 2% of all the positive tests in that week were reported through the app. So that is really a really kind of small percentage, and there is maybe some benefits to this because maybe these people would otherwise not have known that they were infected because they're asymptomatic. But overall, there is a kind of bigger infrastructure. And what is maybe more interesting is that even if you use the app, you are encouraged to get a test, and that happens at the public health authority. And essentially, this is where you sign in with your unique citizen service number. And that's also where this kind of high-tech privacy-aware approach ends, and also where the decentralized approach ends. So basically, everyone, also the privacy-aware users, are kind of channeled or funneled into this system. And there we see really a kind of a different approach in terms of computational infrastructure that is way more everyday, we could say. So it kind of involves, yeah, that worked. It involves Excel and WhatsApp chat groups and kind of readily available cloud databases and some JavaScript. And I don't have all the time in the world now to go into this case, but essentially what happened is that there is a kind of quotidian infrastructure of public and private actors that do testing and do contact tracing, and that also work together with the official vaccine passport app. And there were leaks and function creeps along this whole pipeline of COVID infrastructure. So personal data could be exported in an Excel file and it was sold on the dark web. logins and personal data were shared on WhatsApp channels. So you have to think of just passport photos being taken with a photo, with a mobile device and shared. And then finally this year, when the vaccine passport became a thing, it was possible with a few lines of JavaScript in a browser to generate a negative test at a private company that was using Google Firestore database with open access, so no right restrictions. And you could then generate a certificate in the official government vaccine passport app. So I guess we can summarize this by saying that there was a kind of well-functioning privacy-aware solution that was embedded in the computational infrastructure that was too old. Some of the systems were from 2003 and they were not pandemic ready, let's say. And they were scaled up without the app security and the app privacy mechanisms. And so these kind of new privacy aware systems were kind of invalidated because of function creep, because of the unintentional use of the system. And so with this case, maybe in the back of your mind, I would like to go back to the concept and try to unpack it a bit and ask what creep is and how we can use it to study algorithmic systems. And also for the purpose of the discussion here, I kind of made two understandings and that I'm very open to change. But to recall, so function creep occurs when the set of functions of an algorithmic system becomes wider, so the functionality expands. And if we look at what that means, it's kind of a divergence of the initial purpose and the actual use of the technology. I think the next one, this is kind of a visualization, let's say, of creep. And so what we could say is that there is one approach, the kind of formalist internal approach, the technical approach, that asks what is the system supposed to do and what is it doing? So how do intent and use maybe diverge? And this approach treats purpose as clear and thinks about an expected outcome. And within that, creep is then kind of an exceptional malfunction. And so, yeah, creep really just occurs here when intent and effect do not match. And this is understanding algorithmic functionality as a vector, kind of a teleological relation. And yeah, I call this formalist also because it really emphasizes form over content and also over context. And it also made me think of, since we're doing a workshop on models, of the kind of what people call the mother of all models. So the diagram of a general communication system of Shannon. And in that article, as Xiaoqin Wei once pointed out, there is this sentence that the semantic aspects of a communication are irrelevant to the engineering problem. And I think that there is something interesting in the context of privacy about this sentence, because today certain semantic aspects of communication require kind of a different approach, and that is being privacy aware. So in that sense, communication engineering today is about protecting the semantic aspects. But anyway, this is still kind of a functionality approach that is concerned with form, and so the form in which messages are conveyed and how well they are transmitted. And this approach assumes that there is no creep when a system does not malfunction, and that we can kind of delineate the functionality of a system quite clearly. And that the functionality can be designated and designed. And what this approach ignores is that technology is much less about declared intent and much more about the effects of an apparatus. And that also includes hypothetical effects. So I'm getting kind of towards the integrated approach, maybe an alternative, where creep might be more like a disposition. So if we remember the fact that algorithmic systems are multi-purpose, then comparing intent and use is somewhat useless because there's always going to be a mismatch. But if we assume that creep always occurs and that creep is kind of a necessary deviation, then maybe we can use creep to understand the kind of norms and interests, as I said in the beginning, that govern the use of an algorithmic system. And so then looking at creep might help us to kind of read this difference of intent and disposition. And with disposition, I mean the inclinations and the possible functions of an algorithmic system. So the difference between the two ideas, I guess, comes down to knowing how and knowing what. So this approach also wants to know how. And so how does the system creep and how is the functionality conditioned? And how are these systems embedded in other systems? And so to round off and to kind of maybe go back to the case, the question would be, how can we use creep to read this kind of infrastructure of the COVID tracing? And what creeps then is maybe not the function, but more the infrastructure that makes the functionality possible. So we could understand creep kind of as a infrastructural phenomenon that affects or makes certain functionality possible. I guess often we speak about systems and algorithmic systems in terms of still functionality, but really what we're interested in is kind of how systems and the surrounding structures are connected to power. And so we could say then that creep is kind of not a technical exception, but it's a tension between the internal technical materialities and kind of external political economic interests that govern algorithmic systems. But they are difficult to neatly divide. So the question is where creep occurs and where does it not occur? And then final remark about the case. One thing that with this approach, I think we see is that Google and Apple kind of provide the only solution that is privacy aware, while the rest of the infrastructure is essentially not working as it's supposed to be. And this is not just a malfunction or an accident, but it's kind of related to how the computational infrastructure creeps and how it's moved by interest and how it's shaped by them. Because what we see is that privacy becomes more valuable, needs to be protected, and that the provision of privacy becomes a service, maybe similar to what Max was mentioning. So the infrastructure in which privacy needs to be preserved is, of course, dominated by the actors who first profited from low privacy. So think of Google advertising, tracking people, right? And these same actors now provide kind of high-level privacy solutions in an infrastructure that they dominate, and smaller actors such as the public health authorities or smaller testing companies, they can't compete with that. So yeah, creep, I think, is infrastructural and not just in a technical sense, but it's how platform capitalism kind of traverses and shapes its own infrastructure. And we see now that this creep, or this kind of mechanism creeps not just into the personal, so data, but also in the kind of provision of the personal moment. That's my thoughts on creep.